Welcome, welcome. Glad to see you guys made it in here. As you could tell, I had a little bit of problems getting in here. My name's Michael Itagaki. I'm your leader of the workshop tonight. I am a instructor here at Cal State Fullerton, but this is the first time I've gone through with doing a workshop via Zoom with project upgrads here. And so there was a little different way to sign in, and it took a bit longer than I would have liked. But glad to see that you guys are here, those of you that made it. I figure there's going to be a few more folks filing in, maybe trying to get in also, having some potential issues, which is okay. But I'm going to put up a PowerPoint for us to kind of walk us through some things here, and kind of kick us off with a little bit of an icebreaker using our breakout rooms for the folks that are here. But you're here for some assistance with writing, correct? And I think this is kind of one of those things that it's universal. It's something that it's essential for your success in college and in life, I think. And one of the things, whenever I entered a class or whenever I went into a workshop, I wanted to find out, well, why should I pay attention to the person that's running things here? And so, as I mentioned, I teach, and as you saw on the cover slide there, that I teach in both the sociology and kinesiology departments. I also have spent some time working as a tutor of sorts for some graduate students working on their theses and other projects. And that's kind of how I got involved with the upgrads program. And but this is why in the sociology department, I used to teach the upper division writing course, and why they've asked me to lead this workshop is that before I became a teacher, although it looks like I've been doing this a while, and it is, I can't believe this is my, I'm working on 15 plus years here in education. But before that, my previous career, I worked in the field of journalism. And I worked at the Los Angeles Times back when it was at the old decrepit historical landmark in downtown Los Angeles. It has since relocated by the LA airport. And I served as both in many capacities as a writer, a desk assistant, a copy editor. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that while I've had the privilege to work with some of the best writers in the world and have seen what I think is some of the best writing around, is that even the best writers could easily get confused, something like this. And here's your little tidbit to kick us off, that the word effect here, that the vast majority of the time you will, if you're using effect as a noun, it's the effect with an E, right? That it is the special effects in a movie, for instance, right? And to cause a change in something, impact something, that is effect, right? That you were affected by the movie in some way, right? That's with the A for the action, or most oftentimes it's the verb form. Now, the thing that gets tricky is that they do have, in smaller instances, where affect with an E can be a verb, and affect with an A can also be a noun, but those are kind of the lesser used versions of that. But even the best writers get tripped up in that. But in the years that I spent teaching, the years that I spent as a copy editor and a writer, one of the consistencies I found is that good writing is good writing, whether it's in the sports department at a newspaper or the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist at the newspaper, whether it's a textbook, whether it is a student's essay, whether it is my friend's email. Good writing is good writing, things that are easy to read. And that's kind of one of the things that we are going to kind of explore this evening, that hopefully in the process, this can be part of your journey. One of my favorite teachers and authors on writing is John Trimble. He stated this, that for us, the trick with writing is trying to figure out our own voice. We kind of get inundated sometimes of trying to mimic other people, and it can kind of eliminate our own individuality. And one of the ways we can do that is simply write how we talk. That doesn't mean we get rid of our grammar or those kinds of things, but we speak the truth, the things that we know, offer, and especially in our academic setting, offer facts, give evidence for things versus trying to posture or present our opinions or those kinds of things, right? So this is what we're going to do to kind of kick us off here, all right? As this is what I kind of have dubbed a right process, that we're going to explore these things tonight, how we can gain perspective on how we're writing things, what are the pieces that are key to putting together an effective writing essay or email or what have you, right? And then we can polish it all off to make it as good as it can be. But one of the things that I thought might be helpful is I'm going to send us into breakout rooms right now, all right? And all I want you guys to do is, it looks like we have 19 people, including me. So we're just going to get into pairs here. And for 30 seconds each, all right? I'll kind of give you guys a heads up when I'm going to close the breakout room. I just want you to introduce yourself to the other person in your breakout room and tell them what one of your fears of writing is. What's one of the things that has you concerned? One of the things that's difficult, one of the challenges perhaps, because I think that's why the majority of you are here tonight, okay? So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms here. You guys should be in pairs, all right? And then go in, introduce yourself, and one of your concerns about writing, a challenge about writing, okay? And then I'm going to send out a message when we're getting close to closing the rooms. It's going to be quick, okay? Take maybe 30 seconds each, and then we'll come on back. And as you guys come on back, I'm going to have you just put one of the observations from your pair as you guys share with each other. Decide, well, which one of you is going to just post one of those things on the chat, okay? And we'll post that up in the chat as you guys come out of the breakout rooms, all right? Does that make sense, everyone? Share with each other just one of your challenges, concerns, fears about writing, okay? Head on in and I'll gather you guys back in a couple of minutes. Go to it.
I don't know what happened, but no one joined.
No one joined your
Yeah.
room with you? Okay,
No.
let's see. Let's see here. Alexa, are you there? All right, Heather, I'm going to move you over with Austin and Jenny, okay?
Okay. It didn't move me. I don't know.
Did you see something on your screen, Heather? You
No.
should see.
Nothing, nothing appeared. I know like when I was joining group one, I clicked over, but it didn't, nothing. No.
Okay, all right. Let's see. Well, you and Leah and Yuan, you guys can just chat real briefly here as I'm going to be wrapping folks up here in a minute.
All right,
Just-
thank you. We were kind of talking in our own breakout room and we were like, "Sure, we late?" So we came back, but thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Heather. Nice to meet you. I'm Leah.
Hi, Leah. I think you're in my classes.
Oh, yes. For
Yeah.
the special education department.
Yes.
Oh, very nice. It's good
Yeah.
to put a voice to the name.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, we were just talking about why we were here and for experience and kind of exposure in the setting. So we'll go ahead and put that in the chat.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
So folks are coming on back, and as you guys are coming in, just put one of your pairs observations in terms of a common challenge or concern. And one of the things that I think is helpful as we get started is when we're able to kind of see that other folks kind of have similar concerns that we do, it kind of I think it helps alleviate some of our anxieties with things and understanding that a lot of people struggle with different types of things. I see, one of the first ones we have up there is just an academic style of writing. And again, one of the things hopefully that you'll take away from tonight is seeing that an academic style, sometimes I think it gets overstated, that if we just write clearly, that is more than good enough. And it's just understanding some of the mechanics of, say, like APA or MLA style, just like with where do we put the parentheses and those kinds of things. And those are handy style guides that kind of help us with that. Presenting data clearly, absolutely. Those are challenging things when we have some of those numbers. And again, one of the things that I'll emphasize as we go through tonight, it's in our own voice. If we understand it and we can write it, it's being a good judge of that, being able to read what we wrote down. And if that makes sense to us, then that's a good start. And then we can always ask upon our friends as well. One of the things that I'm big on is having your friends and your peers take a look at your work to give you some feedback. And putting the things and getting the things on the page, those absolutely are big challenges, because it's one of those things that it sounds good up here, but does it look so good on the paper? All right. So as those things start coming in, all right, I'm gonna kick us off. There's a lot of things. It was interesting when I was talking to Luis Molina about this particular workshop. There are so many different things that I would love to kind of get to, and I think I'm going to just try and hit some of the highlights of each of these areas. And these 3 Ps, I think, are kind of good reminders for us. And what I kind of call this process is, number one, we have to have the right perspective, and then we have to have the right pieces, and then we want to be able to polish off our writing too. And I'll kind of step through each of these 3 things one at a time, these big sections. But when I say perspective, I'll talk a little bit about how we shift our perspective, how we the approach we want to take to writing. And that can make a big difference when we start things. Looking at the pieces, what are the key elements? What are the arguments? What are the, as you guys are talking about, what's the data? What are those things that we want to put out there? All right. And how do we find those things? And how do we craft those together once we even identify those pieces? And the last part, how do we kind of put it all together and polish it so that it is this cohesive piece of writing that we are proud to present. All right. Now, what I mean by perspective, when we want to write for reading, a quick question to ask ourselves: why do we write? Okay, why do we tackle something in a particular way? And one of the key reminders for us is that a lot of times we do these things because we're, like, if we're journaling, it's for ourselves. We want to get our thoughts down on paper. But when we talk about this idea of writing for reading purposes, it's try and shift that perspective from we're sitting down at a computer, putting those words in, versus who is reading them? What are they going to do when they see those first words we have to write? What is their impression going to be? And so we have to write, the right perspective is to write for our readers. This quote from F.L. Lucas, who's an author, a poet, he talked about this idea of, if we want to clearly present something to our readers, we have to take that approach that we're going to serve them. We're going to serve them like a server at a restaurant. All right, we want to take the trouble to try and anticipate our readers' needs versus to pontificate to them or to impress them. We want to write something clearly so that they can understand it, that we anticipate what it is they want. So it's this mentality of serving them. Trimble talked about this idea of the novice approach versus the veteran approach. The veteran approach, we want to serve people. The novice approach is where we forget about the reader, where we just assume the message we're trying to send out. And you think about it with writing, it's very much like speaking. We have a message we want to convey to somebody, right? And if we forget about the reader, or there's something that gets cut off in our type of communication, the message is not going to be received, right? And so this idea of how do we effectively do this? How can we serve our readers? Okay, and one of the ways that we can do that we can keep their attention, right? Anybody can pick up a piece of writing, whether it's a paper, it's a blog, it is a magazine article, and the reader, ultimately, you can just walk away. You can swipe away and not read that any longer. And so one of the key things is trying to figure out, well, you can serve them by keeping their attention. That means bring them things that are interesting, bring them things that are compelling. Other things that we can do is that we can practice common courtesies, much like just these manners that we have with how we treat one another, manners at a table. We have these kinds of things when we write, things like grammar, things like our tone and our voice, that we want to be able to try and serve our readers and be compassionate to them, be courteous. And these are things that we can do by anticipating if they have maybe questions about things that we are bringing. And if we shift our perspective from this is me writing to how is somebody going to read this, that goes a long way toward us being able to communicate our message effectively. And that's what we want to do when we write. So I talk about that first step in the writing process is making sure we shift that perspective to the reader's perspective, not just what we want to get on the page and the information we're trying to transmit. Now, part of these pieces that we want to, that information we're trying to carry in our message to our readers it's key to identify those elements. And I'm going to talk about these three things. The idea of a thesis. This is kind of a word that maybe is less familiar for some of you. The idea of the middles, that's the meat of our essays, story. This is kind of the main part of whatever writing piece that you're putting together. And then how do you finish it to make a lasting impression upon your reader? And one of the things that I kind of emphasize with my students, that one of the best ways to start when we identify our elements is we want to start in the middle. And we want to start with these things, what I call the middles. And what do I mean by that? Because when we are taught with reading and the things and how we structure our writing pieces, especially in an academic sense, remember that idea of the 5-part essay. And that's probably something that many of you may have even been taught way back in grade school. And guess what? That 5-part essay, basic structure, it's effective even at the graduate school level. Where you have the introduction, 3 main points, that's 4, and then our conclusion at the bottom. But we are taught at the top, we need that thesis statement. That thesis statement that's going to tell us what everything is about. And when we think about a thesis statement, these are some of the key elements of it. We have to kind of acknowledge that a thesis, it should tell our readers something about what is it we're writing about? What is it that we are examining? And it should be specific, again, to try and hold our readers' attention, to make sure it's compelling. Thesis statements should make an arguable claim. What type of position are we taking on something? It should be a declarative statement, not a question. And we want to present evidence. We want to offer support for that thesis statement. That doesn't mean we lay out everything that we're going to go over in the paper, but at least some short bullet point ways to kind of present this, all right? And so I give you a quick example here, is that if you take a specific topic like academic performance, we can make an arguable statement about this, right? We can say something like, students who attend class, they do better in college. And that we have lots of academic studies that support this, right? That there is a correlation that we see between student attendance and GPA. We see a correlation between student attendance and even test scores. Anecdotally, I have plenty of evidence that I've seen over the years to support this, right? But if we have this, especially in our academic papers, when you find viable sources to support that, these are things that we can put in a very quick statement for a thesis at the top of our papers. This tells the reader, this is what our paper is going to be about. Students with higher rates of attendance, they show better academic performance. So these things where we give the general topic, we make a claim, and then we show some evidence. Sometimes we can get a little bit more specific if we want to whet the reader's appetite. They have better academics, have higher GPAs, higher graduation rates, lower dropout rates. And then you can see those 3 points. And within that, we have maybe these academic studies that actually measure that. And whether it's in the United States, it's in Europe, in Asia, what have you. All right. But we have those things. And that's kind of that key element of this thesis statement. Now, one of the challenges I think we have is that how do we start from a writing perspective? That thesis statement, it seems so daunting at the beginning because, and this is where I say, how do we get started? I encourage everybody, hey, start in the middle. And one of the immediate reactions I get from many students that, hey, this sounds kind of backwards. And it is counterintuitive in some ways, because think about all the years and how we've been taught the idea of the inverted pyramid. What are our most important things? That's a journalism model, right? But especially when we read, we go from chapter 1 to chapter 25. We read sequentially, but it's not healthy for us, I think, to write in that fashion, because how do you know what your thesis is unless you know what your main bits of information are? What are your most important details? You may find something very important and relevant to your topic, maybe the first article or research finding you have, and that's fantastic. But the absolutely best one, it may not be unearthed by you until you're 3-4 weeks into the process of finding what's your material. And until you get a good bank of material to work with, you don't know how to collate it. You don't know how to organize it. And so this is why I encourage students. It's like, don't worry about your thesis at the beginning. How can you write a thesis unless you know what you're going to write about? So you got to get your material, right? You got to get your data. You got to get those things. And in this process, you want to gather things and you got to find ways to organize and collate them. And as you're doing that, you're analyzing that information. That goes to this part that Heather and Jenny asked about, the idea of synthesizing and how that becomes challenging. And one of the things that I encourage you guys to think about is that as you're putting stuff together, if we just start to get the individual bits of data together and those bits of facts to support your argument, sometimes you're going to have to tweak your argument. Sometimes you're going to have to change it, and that's okay. And so thinking about a working thesis at the beginning, a working thesis, a draft thesis that give you flexibility, that based on these things, that when you're starting in the middle, what are the things you're gathering? What are the articles you're finding in the Pollock Library as you're assembling, say, your literature reviews? What are those things that you are gathering? And when you are bringing them in and organizing them, it's trying to figure out, well, how does something connect with something else? What is one of my most compelling facts? Do I want to put that up higher? And that's where you start to put all these bits and pieces together, all right? But it starts with 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4. But then once you have more of these facts together, then it becomes easier to put some in this pile, put some in that pile, put some in this row, and then you can shift them, because maybe you have this one here that it kind of goes here, but it can also fit with this one. And that's when you get creative and you let your creativity come out and say, well, how do I want to present this? And give yourself kind of the flexibility to do so. So gathering that data, this isn't really a research part, but using those resources we have at Cal State Fullerton are helpful, especially with the Pollock Library database. But thinking about how we gather them, you need to find a way to organize yourself in terms of those different facts, because then once you can find kind of like short ways to express those bits of evidence, then work backwards. You have that evidence now. How can you reshape your thesis? And right then your thesis becomes more dense. Your thesis becomes more concise. Your thesis becomes more compelling, because then it is attached to actual facts and data that you have. All right. One of the things that I was kind of looking at this, and I did this with another workshop, and what I wanted to do is be able to make sure we had time tonight, because we're a little bit shorter on time, where we have about an hour, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions and answers at the end. All right, but we're going to do this where I want you guys to, instead of doing it as a group, and some of you may feel like you want to post your particular thesis to the chat, but we're going to kind of do this individually. And I want to just show you a quick little video here. All right, and it's something that I think it's well known in for many folks, and I think it's kind of a little bit of fun as we take a little break with this here. All right, but I want you guys to think of some of those principles that I talked about, with the thesis being, and here, let me put this back up here. That a thesis that can that has to be your kind of take on things, right? And that it has to make a claim, and you have to think about some potential evidence for it. All right. Let me put this back up on the share here. Share that. Okay. But this idea of what is something that is arguable, but you could make this declarative statement about it. All right. Now, the presumption that I am making too is that the vast majority of you guys are familiar with the Star Wars universe, right? And one of the things that I think is kind of fun to do is to think about the arc of the Star Wars, and even going back to the original trilogy. And what we're going to do is I want you to think about those first 3 movies, okay? And we're going to kind of talk about how you could perhaps come up with a thesis statement for the first 3 Star Wars movies. For those of you who are not as familiar with it, okay, here is a little bit of a snippet of this, okay? And let me put this up on the screen here. Let me make sure I have this up here, because this will take all of 2 minutes. All right. That is here.
There's no sound.
Okay. Let's see here. All right, let me do this here. All right, this is causing more trouble than it's worth right now. All right, let me shift gears. All right. Okay. So when we think about the idea of a thesis statement, and this was just more from an illustrative perspective, that if you look at something like that, you could come up with something like this, right? And argue that the theme of the movies is about, it's a story of redemption, all right? And your evidence you could pull from specific elements from each of the movies, and how the villain goes from finding ways to destroy planets and to eliminate the rebellion, to even confronting his son. But even though he's on this dark path, he chooses not to kill his son. And then ultimately he decides at the end to save his son, right? And then where he finds freedom in that. And part of this idea of a thesis, and why a thesis is key for us, and why it's inseparable from our middles, is that the middles are the things that support it. They are the things that support it. Now, while a thesis and our middles, they need to have these elements. They need to draw our attention into our readers. They have to be something that it's arguable. They have to be short. And the analogy I like to use with that is a thesis is like a roadmap. If we are about to, for instance, go on a trip, that our thesis, it provides this kind of direction and layout that this is what we're going to do. And that's what a good thesis is going to do, is that it tells the reader, these are the big things that we're going to tackle. But the middles, the facts, the evidence, those explain all the key highlights, right? They give the details that while the map shows us we're going to start in Monterey, being there and seeing the scenery there, that's the evidence. That's the experience of that. Or whether it's being in Yosemite or then ending up in Las Vegas. This evidence, this is what gives power to our writing. All right, so we need to come up with these facts and things that are compelling, and we organize it. But if we start with that first, we gather those things, then we can formulate some kind of coherent thesis that is compelling. And so the goal is to use our middles as these building blocks. And so these are some things I want you to think about in terms of having this kind of checklist as you're assembling your essays, is that you want to have that well-defined thesis. And while we may put this at the top and say that it's crucial, this shouldn't be the first thing that you're working on. You should try to find good evidence first. And with this, then you can build a clear strategy. And then as you're building your thesis, you start to develop this clean narrative line. And then with the evidence, find your most compelling thing and you put it as your closer. And I kind of use this visual too with a thesis, that this is kind of what we start off with at the beginning. And along the way, as you gather more material, it's like an artist crafting these things, and it becomes and gets more definition, and we add more detail that we just can't get here in a heartbeat. We got to go through the planning stages and find all those perspectives and find the different things to work with. That's kind of what that well-defined thesis does. Now, as you're developing that, you need to come up with a game plan or a strategy, that what areas, what buckets of information are you looking for to try and gather. That way, then, if you have a structure, you kind of focus your research in particular areas related to a topic that you're interested in, right? That it's not just finding haphazard things, you're targeting particular things. Now, also remember with your game plan, much like in sports, you have to be able to shift and to pivot and change gears. If you find something compelling that doesn't quite fit in a bucket the way you have it structured, change the structure. That's okay. But being flexible with your game plan, but having a game plan, that will help you be more focused, all right? So that idea of what I pointed out, having that strategy of going through and saying, well, am I going to look at each particular movie and see how it illustrates this transformation of evil to good? Find one scene or one theme from each movie. You cover the whole trilogy. It's kind of a strategy that you have to find that, all right? Now, other things that we will get into a little bit more, but to illustrate how I wanted to address this here too. I think it was appropriate since you guys asked about that idea of synthesizing and keeping things together. Oftentimes, synthesizing can be even a bit more mechanical than we think, that it's a way of connecting and bringing things together. That some of the ways we can do that is what we call signposting in our writing, where it is taking certain things that when we are presenting particular data, that we connect this with, well, the Death Star, it destroyed planets, and we kind of go down that path. But as you go from that first one, that the first movie in Star Wars, this is what happened. But then in The Empire Strikes Back, this is what happens. And then in Return of the Jedi, this is what happens. We build a rhythm. We use similar language where we connect the three movies for the reader, much like you could have your three topics that you're looking at, or what have you, however you organize it. But if you set that up in your thesis, then the reader kind of knows this is the language I'm looking for. This is what the writer is going to kind of present to us. Then they're a lot more prepared. All right. And so having that strategy is very helpful. All right. And this all comes, it's a part of that building stage when you're gathering those pieces in the middle. All right. And so you have these things, you want to find bits of evidence that are going to stand out, that they're going to be convincing to your readers, something that is compelling. Having the idea of a clean narrative line, it involves that strategy, and how you execute that is with your language and your diction. And to get to that in our final part is we're polishing off, where it's we not only set up our roadmap, but we follow it. We follow those particular stops on the route, and we give our reader these signposts and say, these are our buzzwords, these are our keywords, and you use that. But you start to build that in your middles, and then hence as you go with each step, you already have a framework that you can just simply repeat those things as you go along. You build up a rhythm as you go along. But again, with this, it's a process that it starts in the middle of things as you are grabbing all of your information. The idea with a closer, a conclusion that makes one compelling, is if it is concise, if it's short, it's to the point, if it's something that convinces our readers and it also is engaging, that is something that is a persuasive closing conclusion to your papers or essays. And that's why I encourage you, as you are looking for your evidence, oftentimes leave that most compelling piece. Leave something that's colorful, that makes an impression. Leave that for your conclusion, to find some way to weave it into your final point, because then that's going to make the emotional impact on your readers. That 5-part essay, okay, remember those basic principles. They work at the graduate school level just like they did in undergraduate, as they did in your AP English high school courses, back in your 6th grade English language arts types of papers. All of that thing, if it starts off with a good thesis where you have something to grab the attention of the reader, tell them what you're going to be going over. Give them a hint of the evidence you have, because then that whets their appetite. Then you can hit them with all of the stuff in the body of the paper. And if you keep it concise, you keep it short, you keep it quick hitting, fact after fact after fact, it just continues to punch and punch and punch so your reader gets the point, right? And if you set it up with a strong thesis and that roadmap, then it's easy to follow along with it. It's easy to see that flow. And then you leave them with that lasting impression. So what do we do when we're left with the final process here? Okay, we have changed our perspective. We want to write from a reader's perspective. Okay, try and figure out what is it that is most compelling to a reader. You want to try and see it from their perspective. And so that's why sometimes it helps to have a friend, a classmate, somebody to take a look at your work. But that's one of the key things, is to take that perspective of the reader first, to take that veteran approach. And then what are the things that are important that we're going to be writing about, that start in the middle and gather your information as you're identifying those things. Then you can craft that concise, compelling, and just great thesis that sets the table for your entire work. Now, this last thing I want to talk about is, what are some tips that we can have when it comes to editing and refining your prose? Well, some simple things like having that clean narrative line or continuity, that pesky word transitions. We often hear those things and they can be challenging to us. But one of the things that I encourage you guys to do is that it's often much more mechanical than we want it to be, or we want it to believe it to be. I remember back in my journalism days that one of my colleagues I asked him about the whole process of putting together a 20 to 25 paragraph story in the span of 15 minutes, where he would cover a baseball game that sometimes the game wouldn't end until 10:20, 10:30 at night. And he would have to post his first version of his story to us by 10:50. He would have all of 20 minutes. And I would ask him, hey, how do you do that? And he was doing exactly this process I was talking about here. He did it from the middle out. He talked to me about, hey, well, you think about it with a game, what are some things that we see all the time in a sports news story? Well, we want to find out what the final score was. We want to find out who the principal players and the key figures, the heroes were. We want to find out who the scoring leaders or who made the big plays. What were some pivotal moments in the game? What did the key performers have to say about it? What did they say they did right or wrong? And so you have these kind of consistent pieces that as the game is going along, he would type things in and say, hey, this looks like a big play, and he would write about it. Or he would set it up and see that so-and-so was having the big game, LeBron James was having the big game, whoever. You write that and you insert the actual number of points, you insert that in later, the actual data. But you have all of these almost kind of constant pieces in your middles. All right. And so you construct that. And I asked him, I said, hey, isn't that kind of mechanical about it? And he said, in some ways, yes, but he said it's not just plugging in those pieces, it's how do you smooth out and transition from thing to thing. And even simple phrases like this, and this list here. And I'm going to make sure that this, the PowerPoint presentation will be available to you guys too, I think, that upgrads can make that available to you. The recording of this will also be available so you can see it through there. But these words are among the many that you can use to transition and to kind of set up something else as you are kind of presenting a main point and then you're getting to one specific of it. You start off that next paragraph with, for example. Is that magical? I think sometimes this idea of writing, that it flows out of us, it really is more just hard work. And what tools do we have in our toolbox? What do we have at our disposal? And so creating that continuity, even is just having a list of these words close by to us. And as we write more, they come to mind for us as ways that we can bridge one paragraph to another paragraph. Or one quick way to do that too is if you see that last word that closes a sentence in one paragraph, or that last phrase, if there is a similar word, a synonym for it, or even the same word that you can kick off your next paragraph with, that's a wonderful way to keep the reader in transition. Pardon me. Other ways to improve readability, things that sound good in principle, we're told to be more descriptive in our writing, which I'm not against, but some of the best writers, Mark Twain, this is what he talked about with adjectives, to cut them out. Adverbs too. When in doubt, strike it out. The idea of killing most of them, the ones that you do choose to leave in, they will be very valuable. And think about Twain's principle here, these intensifiers, very, really, extremely clearly, just get rid of them. She was very upset. What's another word you could use for that? Here, we have almost a verb, right? This intransitive verb, she was shattered. That is a much more colorful and descriptive way than saying she was very upset by something. I'm not very hungry, the person was ravenous. Stuart Brand, who was a writer, this is what he wrote about one of his editors, James Donnelly, for which I am whimperingly grateful. That idea of we see that image of someone that they're grateful, but at the same time cringing because someone is asking them to kind of change their writing. Getting rid of adjectives, adverbs. Secondly, if you ever pose a question to your reader, answer it promptly. You can share your roadmap, but don't just leave the roadmap out there without taking the reader on the journey to there. Don't leave them hanging. So for instance, if you are kind of talking about or implying this comparison, like in this one, not as successful as the second group, and the second group used alternative strategies to prepare. Don't just jump from that into, well, and the third group did this, because isn't this a natural question right here? What strategies? What strategies? Answer that question with the next sentence. When you do that, then it sets up a rhythm for the reader. Okay, they kind of go along and say, they kind of have a leading sentence here. They're going to follow it up. That compels the reader to keep grinding and keep going through. Versus if they don't, it's like the reader is left with a question in their head, and that's when you start to lose them, right? You have them thinking about something else other than the words that are on your page. Be bold. Read your own prose aloud. Hearing your own voice, sometimes you realize, hey, that really just doesn't sound very good at all. And that will force you to try and change your words, to change your wording, to make it more concise, to make it more sound like you. And who better to know who sounds like you than yourself? You can shorten your paragraphs, be more concise. And one of the ways we can be more concise is simply in our words that we use. The diction that we use, much like Twain was talking about, respect words. Use one word instead of 2 or 3 if you can. Be thrifty with them. Since versus for the reason that, all right? When we have our verbs, use active language versus passive verbs. Here's a quick illustration of this. This is one of my favorites, is that the idea of active voice is simply that the subject of a sentence, the noun that is doing the action, that is active voice. So here, Jill climbed the mountain. We see a picture of this person, Jill, climbing a mountain. That is much more colorful and illustrative than flipping it around. Mountain was climbed by Jill. Now, there are times when passive voice is appropriate if the focal point you want to emphasize happens to be the object. Sure, there are cases where passive voice works, but active voice in general is much more effective, much more clear, much more descriptive. And so it's the active voice, the subject's doing the action, the passive voice, the subject has the action being done to them, right? They are the object. The way we can recognize these passive verbs, oftentimes they're going to include the verb to be, is, are, was, were, these past participles ending in ed. The mountain was climbed by Jill. Sometimes, as I mentioned, it was appropriate. If the focus here is the person who was injured, yes, you can use that. If it's a command, the emphasis here being the note was left in the mailbox. You don't know who the kidnappers or whoever were. Maybe you don't want them to be the focus of the sentence. You want it to be the ransom note. The focal point of the sentence should be your subject. And that's when passive voice is appropriate, okay? One of the things that we think about too is that it's preferable, and thinking about how you can flip it around. And in this case, this was one instance of how you can even shorten a relatively short sentence and make it even that much more punchy. And this is one of the things that you can go around and around circles about with our editing, is that you can constantly write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. All right. And those are some of the things that I think are good, and they can be healthy. But also, one of the things that I really appreciate about being in the discipline of academic writing, that at some point in time, you have to be able to let things go. All right. And you have to be able to rewrite, but we have deadlines, you have end of semesters, and so you got to release your papers, right? A couple of last things to leave you with. All right. Let me put this one up here, this last slide, and then we'll have some time for any questions, or as I'm putting up the slide, if you guys have any specific questions about some of the things that I've gone over, please go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll try to address them. Let me put this up here. Here we go. Ray Bradbury, Ford, Maddox Ford, two writers, kind of talked about this idea of how do we maintain this idea of freshness, and that is try to find ways to surprise your readers. Is there something unexpected you found? Is there something that you looked at a piece of research that was going in one direction and then it suddenly changed directions? Those are the types of surprises that are engaging to readers. And it's these unobservable ones is what Ford kind of talked about, that can really be engaging to readers. And so I encourage you to kind of look for those ways to kind of put it in there, and that it's sometimes ones that they don't have to be these big aha moments, but sometimes they're just these small ones that kind of keep the reader moving along. Now, that being said, as you kind of absorb all these things that I'm presenting to you tonight, the last thing I want to close up with before we get to further questions from you is, what are ways that you can do this as you think about, for me as a former editor, you want to get in the rewriting process, but one of the things I think that I found very helpful is understanding that, and why I like working in schools, is that you have to let things go and release it, and keep that and take that to heart. And almost with anything that you approach, I encourage you to go with the mantra of give your third best. Now, that may sound counterintuitive to many of us because we're taught you got to give 100%, you got to give your best effort. But when it comes to something concrete like writing, and sometimes when we write and we rewrite and we rewrite and rewrite, or we're confronted with a mountain of all these essays to do, take that attitude of give them your third best. The idea even that your second best, the old saying was that your best is this ideal that can't be achieved, and then the second best is one that by the time you deliver your second best, it's too late to do anybody any good. So just give them your third best. And so that mentality of being able to release it, and that's okay. And I think some of the things you'll find is that even your third best is a lot better than you would have imagined, especially if you follow some of these basic principles that I kind of walk through tonight. All right. So some of the things that any questions that you guys want to have, you can pop into the chat, and I'll also kind of open it up for you guys right now. And as you guys are putting questions into the chat, or if you have some, as we begin to wrap up tonight, I'm going to put this link into the chat that the folks at Upgrads have asked me to send this out to you guys. It's a Qualtrics survey that if you could just fill this out and that kind of will help them. Here's the link here. And so hopefully you guys can click on that and fill that out for the folks who hosted our workshop tonight. But I wanted to make sure I left some time at the end. I know we've hit 8 o'clock, but for those who want to hear or have any questions or other things